17 years ago, a devoted husband vanished during a duck hunting trip in the freezing waters of Lake Seminole. Search teams spent weeks looking for him, but they never found a body. Authorities believe the alligators had destroyed the evidence. Case closed. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Because nearly 2 decades later, investigators digging through a remote Florida swamp uncovered something horrifying buried beneath the mud. Human bones, a wedding ring still attached to a skeletal hand, and shotgun pellets lodged inside the skull. This was an accident. It was an execution. What followed exposed one of the most chilling betrayals in modern true crime history, involving secret affairs, hidden motives, millions in life insurance, and 2 people hiding in plain sight behind the image of the perfect Christian family. The deeper investigators looked into Mike Williams' disappearance, the darker the story became, because the man responsible for helping search for Mike may have been the same man who killed him, and the person grieving beside Mike's family for 17 years was hiding secrets of her own. This is a haunting true story of manipulation, obsession, deception, and a murder that almost disappeared forever beneath the swamp. The swamp had kept its secret for 17 years. Rainwater slid through black mud beneath the glare of floodlights as investigators pushed deeper into the marshlands of northern Florida. The ground swallowed their boots with every step. Mosquitoes drifted through the darkness. Pumps roared beside trenches carved into the earth, while deputies watched silently from the edge of the dig site, their faces tight with tension. Nobody they were saying it out loud, but every person standing near Carr Lake understood the same thing. If the information they received was true, they weren't searching for evidence anymore. They were searching for a grave. The cadaver dogs had been restless all morning, circling, pulling hard against their handlers. Something beneath the mud was pulling them toward it. Then suddenly one of the dogs froze. Its body stiffened instantly, and seconds later, it began clawing violently at a mound of wet dirt near the trench. Investigators rushed forward. The digging stopped. Nobody spoke. Hands moved carefully through the mud now, slower than before, as if everyone was afraid of what they were about to uncover. Then came the first bone. Human. A silence settled across the swamp, so heavy it almost felt physical. More dirt was cleared away. Another fragment appeared. Then another, part of a jaw, a rib cage, a leg, and then the boots. Dark hunting boots still attached to skeletal remains buried beneath 17 years of mud and water. One investigator later admitted the moment felt surreal, like the swamp had finally decided to give the body back. But the detail that truly chilled everyone came seconds later. There was still a wedding ring wrapped around one skeletal finger, gold shining beneath floodlights. Whoever this man was, he had died wearing that ring. The remains were rushed for forensic examination, and at first investigators expected confirmation of the story Florida had believed for nearly 2 decades. A hunting accident, a drowning, an alligator attack. That explanation had lived so long people stopped questioning it years earlier. Then the x-rays came back. Tiny metal fragments covered the skull. Shotgun pellets. Not one, dozens. The damage pattern was unmistakable. This man hadn't drowned. He had been executed. The discovery shattered everything investigators thought they knew, because the body belonged to a man named Mike Williams. 17 years earlier, on a freezing December morning in 2000, Mike disappeared during a duck hunting trip near Lake Seminole along the Florida-Georgia border. Search crews spent weeks dragging the water. Helicopters scanned the shoreline. Friends searched endlessly through swamp grass and freezing marshes. But Mike Williams was never found. No body. No remains. Nothing. And eventually, authorities accepted the theory everyone feared most. Mike must have fallen from his boat. The icy water drowned him. Then the alligators destroyed the evidence. It was horrifying, but believable. Lake Seminole was filled with gators. The case quietly faded into tragedy instead of murder. Except Mike Williams was never in Lake Seminole. His body had been buried 60 miles away beneath swamp mud near Carr Lake, shot in the face. Hidden for nearly 2 decades while the people closest to him pretended to grieve beside his family. And the deeper investigators looked into Mike's life, the darker the story became. Because the people responsible for Mike Williams' death weren't strangers. They were the 2 people he trusted most. Mike Williams had built his entire life around loyalty, family loyalty, religious loyalty, friendship, the belief that the people closest to you would protect you no matter what. That trust would eventually become the weapon used against him. Friends described Mike as dependable almost to a fault, the kind of man who answered every phone call, the kind who showed up whenever someone needed help, the kind of person people instinctively felt safe around. He grew up in a hard-working Christian family near Tallahassee, Florida, where discipline and sacrifice shaped nearly every part of his childhood. His parents didn't have much money, but they worked relentlessly to give their sons opportunities they never had themselves. Mike thrived inside that environment. At North Florida Christian School, he became the image of the all-American teenager. Athlete, student leader, friendly, driven. Teachers admired him. Parents trusted him. And somewhere in those hallways, he met Denise. She was beautiful in the careful, polished way that immediately drew attention. Soft-spoken, religious, the perfect fit for Mike's world. The two became high school sweethearts, and over time their relationship turned into something people openly admired. Young love, church values, the perfect Christian couple, at least from the outside, because hidden beneath the surface of that marriage was something nobody wanted to acknowledge, especially not within their tightly connected social circle. Another couple from the same school remained close with Mike and Denise for years. Brian Winchester and his wife Kathy. The four of them vacationed together, spent holidays together, went to church together, trusted each other completely. Mike especially trusted Brian. That detail would later haunt investigators, because Brian wasn't just Mike's closest friend. He was also his insurance agent. He handled Mike's life insurance policies personally, policies that would eventually total nearly $2 million. At first, nobody noticed the emotional shift happening between Brian and Denise. Or maybe they noticed it and chose not to look too closely. Small moments, long conversations, private glances, the kind of subtle tension people explain away because the alternative feels too ugly to consider. But over time, the relationship changed. And once it crossed a line into an affair, everything around them became poisoned by secrecy. What made the relationship especially dangerous was how perfectly Brian and Denise reinforced the worst parts of each other psychologically. Mike wanted stability, routine, family. Brian and Denise wanted escape, excitement, attention, and slowly, behind closed doors, their affair stopped feeling temporary. It began feeling inevitable. Years later, Brian would describe a relationship with a phrase investigators would never forget. Bonnie and Clyde. Not lovers, partners in crime. The deeper Brian fell into obsession with Denise, the more Mike unknowingly became an obstacle instead of a husband. And inside their religious community, divorce carried shame, humiliation, judgment. But widowhood? Widows receive sympathy, support, compassion. Nobody blames the grieving wife, especially when everyone already sees her marriage as perfect. That realization changed everything. Because somewhere inside secret conversations nobody else could hear, Mike Williams stopped being a person and started becoming a problem. By late 2000, the fantasy of a future together had transformed into something colder, more practical, more dangerous. And on the morning of December 16th, Mike Williams woke up believing he was going duck hunting with his best friend. He had no idea he was walking into an execution plan designed by the two people he trusted most in the world. Mike Williams grew up believing the world made sense. Work hard, protect your family, trust the people closest to you, stay loyal to God. Those ideas shaped nearly every part of his life long before anyone ever whispered the word murder. In Bradfordville, just north of Tallahassee, Florida, the Williams family lived modestly but proudly. Mike's father drove Greyhound buses for long, exhausting hours, while his mother operated a daycare from home, stretching every dollar as far as possible. They weren't wealthy, far from it, but people who knew the family said the Williams household was built on sacrifice. Mike's parents poured everything they had into giving their sons opportunities they never had themselves. They delayed building a proper home for years just so Mike and his brother could attend private Christian school. And Mike never forgot it. From a young age, he developed the kind of personality that made adults instantly trust him. Polite, responsible, disciplined, the kind of teenager who shook hands properly and looked people in the eyes when they spoke. At North Florida Christian School, Mike became almost impossible to dislike. He played football, served in student leadership, made friends easily. Teachers admired him because he worked hard without needing attention for it. Friends respected him because he never acted superior despite being successful at nearly everything he touched. People later described him using the same words over and over again: reliable, dependable, safe. And then there was Denise, beautiful in a quiet, polished way that drew attention without demanding it. Blonde hair, soft smile, deeply religious upbringing. She looked like the perfect fit for the world Mike wanted to build. The two became inseparable during high school. Young love inside a tightly connected Christian community quickly turned them into the couple everyone expected would eventually get married. And they did. From the outside, their relationship looked almost painfully perfect. Church together, family gatherings together, future plans together. Photos from those years show smiling faces, lake trips, birthday parties, holidays, dinners with friends. The kind of life most people scroll past online and secretly envy. But perfection is dangerous, especially when people become addicted to maintaining the appearance of it. Because inside communities built heavily around image, failure becomes terrifying, divorce becomes shameful, secrets become easier to hide than truth. And slowly, beneath the surface of Mike and Denise's marriage, emotional distance began growing quietly enough that almost nobody noticed it happening in real time. Mike was consumed by responsibility. He worked constantly. After graduating from Florida State University, he became a real estate appraiser and quickly built a reputation for being relentless. Long hours, late nights, endless workloads. By his early 30s, Mike was making exceptional money, reportedly earning nearly $200,000 a year. But the success came with a cost. Friends noticed he was always working, always exhausted, always trying to provide more. And ironically, the harder Mike worked to create the perfect life for his family, the further away Denise seemed to drift emotionally. Then their daughter, Ansley, was born in 1999. People close to Mike said fatherhood transformed him completely. He became softer, more emotional, more protective. There's something haunting about watching old footage of Mike holding his newborn daughter, smiling into cameras like a man who truly believed he had everything he ever wanted. Because at that exact same time, hidden behind the image of a happy family, another relationship was quietly becoming dangerous. Brian Winchester had known Mike for years. The two men shared history, faith, friendships, hunting trips, vacations, and eventually business connections. Brian sold insurance and became responsible for handling Mike's life insurance policies. That detail wouldn't seem alarming until much later. At first, the Winchesters and the Williamses appeared inseparable. Brian and his wife Kathy spent enormous amounts of time with Mike and Denise. The four attended church together, ate dinners together, vacationed together, laughed together, trusted each other completely. Photos from those years now feel deeply unsettling because everyone is smiling. Nobody looks afraid. Nobody looks suspicious. The future killers are standing directly beside the future victim, pretending to love him. And somewhere during those years, Brian's attention toward Denise changed. At first, it was subtle enough to ignore. Longer conversations, private jokes, the kind of emotional closeness people dismiss because confronting it would force them to acknowledge something ugly. But over time, the chemistry between Brian and Denise became impossible to fully hide. Friends sensed tension. Kathy sensed tension. People noticed how often Brian positioned himself around Denise during gatherings, how intensely he watched her when Mike wasn't paying attention. Still, nobody truly confronted it, partly because Mike trusted Brian completely, and partly because nobody wanted to destroy the illusion surrounding these two families. That illusion mattered more than truth. Inside tightly religious social circles, appearances can become a form of survival. People learn how to smile while hiding resentment, learn how to perform happiness, learn how to bury dissatisfaction beneath routine and image management. Denise became especially skilled at it. To outsiders, she still looked like the devoted wife and loving mother. But privately, emotional cracks were widening, and Brian Winchester became obsessed. Not attracted, obsessed. Years later, investigators would uncover just how deeply the affair had infected both of them psychologically. This wasn't simply excitement. It was fantasy, escape, an alternate future they began building secretly together inside their minds. A future where Mike no longer existed. The terrifying part is how ordinary everything still looked from the outside. Mike continued working exhausting hours, continued trusting Brian, continued believing his marriage was stable, continued building a life for people who were slowly betraying him behind closed doors. And the deeper Brian and Denise disappeared into their secret relationship, the more Mike unknowingly became an obstacle instead of a husband. There were warning signs, small ones, the kind that only feel obvious after tragedy rewrites the past. Moments where Denise seemed emotionally disconnected. Moments where Brian's attachment crossed normal boundaries. Moments where friends felt uncomfortable but couldn't fully explain why. Nobody realized those tiny fractures were leading towards something monstrous, because the people around Mike weren't looking at a future murder conspiracy. They were looking at two respected Christian couples living ordinary lives in suburban Florida. That illusion protected the killers long before the murder ever happened. And behind the image of friendship, a secret relationship was already growing. At first, Denise and Brian convinced themselves it wasn't dangerous. Just conversations, just emotional support, just two unhappy people finding comfort in each other inside the safe-looking world they had built around church gatherings, dinner parties, and family vacations. That's how affairs like this often begin. Quietly, not with violence, not with murder, with attention, with validation, with the thrill of finally being understood by someone who isn't your spouse. And for Denise Williams, Brian Winchester became exactly that. Someone who listened, someone who noticed her, someone who made her feel exciting again. Mike, by comparison, had become predictable, reliable, safe. The irony is devastating. Mike was working himself into exhaustion trying to build a perfect life for his wife and daughter, while Denise was slowly falling in love with a man sitting beside him at church. At first, the relationship lived in hidden moments, private phone calls, lingering conversations after gatherings, inside jokes nobody else understood. The secrecy itself became intoxicating, because secret relationships create their own reality over time, a private emotional universe where normal rules stop applying. And the more Brian and Denise disappeared into that world together, the more they began viewing everyone around them as obstacles instead of people, especially Mike. Friends would later remember strange moments they ignored at the time, the way Brian seemed emotionally attached to Denise, how his attention followed her constantly, the subtle tension whenever Mike left the room. People noticed things, but nobody wanted to fully acknowledge what they were seeing, because admitting the truth would destroy the carefully constructed image surrounding both families. An image mattered deeply in their world. Inside conservative Christian communities, divorce carried humiliation, failure, judgment. People whispered about broken marriages. Churches discussed them quietly. Families felt stained by them. Denise understood that. Brian understood it too. And somewhere during the affair, a disturbing idea began taking shape between them. Widows received sympathy. Widows weren't judged. Nobody criticizes a grieving wife standing beside a casket. Nobody questions her tears. Nobody questions her future. That psychological shift changed everything. Because once Mike's death became emotionally easier to imagine than divorce, the relationship crossed into something darker, something poisonous. The affair eventually became physical. Secret meetings replaced emotional conversations. Excuses became more elaborate. The deception became constant. And what made the entire situation even more chilling was how close Brian remained to Mike throughout all of it. The hunting trips continued. The friendship continued. The laughter continued. Mike trusted Brian completely. Completely. That trust gave Brian access to nearly every vulnerable part of Mike's life, including his finances, including his insurance policies. Years later, investigators would become deeply disturbed by the timing of those policies, Because while Brian and Denise were secretly building fantasies about a future together, Mike's life insurance coverage increased dramatically, nearly $2 million. Policies Brian himself helped arrange. The money alone wasn't necessarily proof of murder, but combined with everything else, it created a horrifying picture: an affair, obsession, financial gain, a future waiting on the other side of one man's death. And as the relationship intensified, Brian Winchester's psychology became increasingly unstable. People close to the case later described him as emotionally consumed by Denise, not just in love, dependent, obsessive, like someone building his entire emotional identity around a fantasy life that could only exist if Mike disappeared. That obsession slowly corrupted both of them, because once people begin imagining life after someone's death, morality starts eroding in terrifying ways. Conversations change. Jokes stop sounding harmless. Hypotheticals stop feeling hypothetical. Investigators would later believe the couple spent years psychologically normalizing the idea of Mike no longer being there. At first, maybe it felt impossible, then imaginable, then practical, and eventually necessary. What makes the case especially disturbing is how ordinary their public lives still appeared during all of this. Family dinners, church events, holiday gatherings, photographs full of smiling faces, Mike standing beside the very people secretly betraying him. There's one especially haunting aspect investigators later pointed out. Mike never acted suspicious. Not publicly, not privately. Friends said he genuinely trusted the people around him. He believed loyalty was permanent, believed friendship meant something sacred. And predators are often drawn toward people like that. People who never imagine betrayal, because betrayal isn't something they themselves would ever do. Brian and Denise understood Mike's innocence better than anyone, and instead of protecting it, they weaponized it. Over time, Denise began emotionally disconnecting from her husband almost completely. Friends noticed coldness, distance, subtle frustration whenever Mike was mentioned. But again, nobody pushed too hard. Nobody imagined they were watching the early stages of a murder conspiracy unfold in real time. And beneath all of it was a growing fantasy Brian and Denise shared together. A fantasy where they no longer had to hide. A fantasy where Mike was gone. A fantasy where the insurance money removed every obstacle standing between them. Years later, Brian would describe their relationship using a phrase that sounded less like romance and more like criminal mythology. Bonnie and Clyde, two people against the world, two people bonded by secrecy, two people willing to destroy lives for each other. The deeper they disappeared into that fantasy, the more dangerous they became, because fantasies eventually collide with reality, and reality kept waking up every morning beside Denise. Reality kept going to work. Reality kept trusting Brian. Reality kept making future plans. Reality had a name: Mike Williams. The terrifying question investigators would later spend years trying to answer was simple. Who first crossed a line? Who first stopped fantasizing and started planning? Because somewhere inside late-night conversations and secret meetings, the affair transformed into something irreversible. The relationship stopped being about passion, stopped being about escape, stopped even being about love. It became about removal. And eventually, the affair stopped feeling secret and started feeling trapped. The night before December 16th, 2000, settled over Seminole County like something unfinished. Not peaceful, not quiet, but waiting. The kind of cold that doesn't just drop the temperature, it seeps into bone and memory. Wind moving through the trees like a warning nobody was paying attention to yet. Inside a modest home, Mike Williams slept in the same world that still felt normal. A world where trust still meant something. A world where the people closest to you were not questions waiting to be answered later. But outside that fragile illusion, something had already shifted into place. And by morning, it would never be reversible again. He woke before sunrise, not because of fear, not because of instinct, but because of routine. Duck hunting had always been something clean for him, predictable, a ritual passed through seasons, through friendships, through quiet mornings where the world felt like it belonged only to the water and the sky. There was comfort in it, structure, silence that made sense. That morning, He moved with the calm of someone who believed the day was already written. Boots, gear, waders, shotgun, familiar motions, no hesitation. Every action carried the ease of repetition. Outside, the world was still half asleep. Street lights dimmed against a sky that hadn't decided to become morning yet. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but Mike barely noticed. He had done this too many times for weather to matter. Inside the house, Denise was awake, and she was calm. That detail would later echo louder than anything else. Calm in a way that didn't invite questions. Calm in a way that didn't belong to someone whose husband was walking toward danger. She moved through the house like nothing in the world was about to change. Like there were no fractures forming beneath the surface of the life they shared. She spoke to him. Normal words. Ordinary tone. No urgency. No concern that lingered too long. Just routine. Just morning. And Mike never questioned it. Because betrayal rarely announces itself in a voice that sounds wrong. It usually sounds exactly the same. He stepped outside, breath visible in the cold air, and the night seemed to lean slightly toward him, not stopping him, not warning him, just watching. The truck door shut with a heavy, final sound, and the engine turned over. The world moved forward as if nothing was wrong. But somewhere else, someone else was already waiting. Brian. He wasn't far. He didn't need to be. What matters in moments like this is not distance, but timing. And timing had already been arranged long before sunrise. The lake was still dark when Mike arrived at the launch point. Lake Seminole stretched wide and silent, its surface broken only by faint ripples that looked almost like breathing. Fog hovered low over the water, blurring edges, swallowing detail. Everything felt distant, like the world had been muted. There's a particular kind of silence that exists just before something irreversible happens. It doesn't feel peaceful. It feels staged. Mike prepared the boat with steady hands. The kind of hands that don't expect interruption. The kind of hands that believe the only thing ahead is another morning of hunting, another memory to add to a life already familiar. He didn't know that someone else had already studied this moment, studied the lake, studied the timing, studied him, not as a friend, but as a variable, a thing that needed to be removed from the equation. The engine started, and the boat slid into water that looked colder than it should have been. As he moved farther from shore, the world behind him began to dissolve. Trees became silhouettes. Land became memory. Everything solid slowly turned into uncertainty. And somewhere in that widening distance, Brian was already positioned, waiting, not rushing, not panicking, patient, because what was coming didn't require speed. It required certainty. Mike's thoughts stayed simple, focused, the kind of mental quiet that hunters rely on. Watch the water, watch the sky, wait for movement. But beneath that calm surface, something else was about to enter frame. Something that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the morning. A disruption, a decision already made. Brian's presence, when it finally intersects with life, never arrives like chaos. It arrives like familiarity, like something that was always supposed to be there. Mike saw him without suspicion. That is the most devastating part of what comes next. No alarm, no hesitation, just recognition. A person he knew, a person he trusted, a person who should have represented safety in a moment like this. And in that instant, the entire direction of the morning bent without breaking yet. Brian spoke. Words carried across cold air. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have triggered doubt. And Mike responded the same way he always had. Like nothing could possibly be wrong. The boat slowed, then stopped. The lake held them both in a quiet pocket time where everything still appeared normal. But normal is often just a final disguise before violence reveals itself. Brian moved closer, close enough now that distance could no longer protect intention. Mike didn't step away, didn't question why the interaction felt slightly off, didn't notice how carefully the moment was being shaped, because betrayal doesn't always begin with force. Sometimes it begins with trust standing still at exactly the wrong time. The water beneath the boat was darker here, deeper, cold enough to feel like it had weight. Mike adjusted his gear. A small motion, A final moment of comfort inside a routine he had done 100 times before, and then the shift, not loud, not dramatic, just a change in energy so subtle it almost disappears if you blink at the wrong moment. Brian's movement was quick, intentional, a single decisive action that turned the morning inside out. Mike went into the water. The lake closed over him instantly, swallowing sound, swallowing direction, swallowing certainty. Cold like impact, cold like shock that doesn't allow thought. For a few seconds, everything became survival. Instinct took over where trust used to live. He surfaced violently, gasping, confusion turning rapidly into alarm. The kind of confusion that refuses to accept what just happened because the mind hasn't caught up to the body yet. The boat was above him. The world tilted in ways it wasn't supposed to. And Brian was still there, still close, still within reach. Mike called out, not in rage, not in accusation, but in disbelief, because even now, even in the freezing water, the brain searches for the explanation that hurts the least. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe something went wrong. Maybe, but the body knows faster than the mind. And the body was already fighting to stay alive. Heavy waders drag at his legs like anchors tied to survival itself. Each movement cost more than it should have. Each breath came shorter than the last. The lake wasn't just cold. It was actively pulling him down, insisting he stop resisting. Mike struggled, fought, panic now fully replacing confusion. He managed to break free from the worst of the weight, kicking, tearing at straps, forcing himself toward air that felt further away every second. Somehow, against conditions that should have ended immediately, he survived the initial drop. He reached a tree stump protruding from the water, barely enough to hold on. His fingers clamped onto it, like the last remaining proof that the world was still real. He was shaking uncontrollably, breathing broken, heart hammering with a rhythm that didn't feel human anymore. And then he saw him, Brian, still there, still above him, still watching. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small, unbearable pieces that assembled themselves into something too large for the mind to accept. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that would be fixed by explanation. This was intentional. The moment that understanding forms in a human mind is never loud. It is quiet. It is slow. And it is completely irreversible. Mike's voice broke across the water. Not a scream yet. Not fully. Something between disbelief and pleading. Because even now at the edge of freezing death, the mind still tries to preserve a version of reality that hurts less. But there was no version left. Brian raised a shotgun, and everything stopped pretending. Time didn't speed up. It narrowed, condensed into a single unbearable tunnel, where every detail becomes sharper than it should be. The sound of breathing, the ripple of water, the faint movement of wind across an open lake that no longer feels like nature, but like isolation. Mike understood, not as a theory, not as suspicion, as fact. This was not rescue. This was not survival gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Something chosen. Something decided before sunrise ever arrived. The betrayal landed harder than the cold, harder than the water, harder than the fear. Because in that final moment before the end, Mike was not just facing death. He was facing the realization that it was delivered by someone he never expected to become the source of it. His voice cracked again, but the words no longer mattered. The lake didn't care. The distance didn't care. And Brian did not respond in the way a friend should. There was no hesitation, no visible conflict, no second thought that the human mind might expect in a moment like this. Only finality. The shotgun fired. The sound didn't echo the way it would on land. It absorbed into water and fog and cold air, becoming something almost unreal, like the lake itself refused to carry it fully. Mike's body reacted before thought could complete itself. Then the water took everything. Silence returned instantly, not peaceful silence. The other kind, the kind that follows a decision that cannot be undone. Above the surface, Brian remained for a moment longer, long enough to confirm what had already happened, long enough for the lake to witness what no one else was supposed to see. Then distance reclaimed the scene. And the morning continued as if nothing had interrupted it. But something irreversible had already settled beneath the water. Mike Williams did not vanish in a lake that morning. He fought in it. He survived it. He reached for life inside it. And for a brief, horrifying stretch of time, he believed he still had a chance. That belief was the last thing taken from him, and the truth that followed would later unravel everything people thought they knew about that day. Because Mike Williams never disappeared in Lake Seminole, his killer took him somewhere else. The water did not confess what it had taken. It rarely does. By the time dawn fully stretched across Lake Seminole, the surface had already returned to something disturbingly normal. Ripples softened. Fog drifted like nothing had happened. Birds called out from the trees with a kind of indifference that felt almost insulting. But beneath that calm, something irreversible had already settled. And far away from the lake, someone was already working to make sure the truth would never rise. Brian didn't rush. There was no need for panic when everything had already been planned in advance. Carr Lake was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel natural once you know what is hiding. The water that didn't just reflect the sky. It swallowed it. A perfect place for something to disappear a second time. Mike Williams' body never came back to shore from Lake Seminole. It was moved, silently, deliberately, not as an act of chaos, but as an act of control. Control over the narrative. Control over the outcome. Control over what the world would believe. Because in cases like this, the real crime is never just what happened in the water. It's what happens after. And Brian understood that better than most. The body was placed where it would be found eventually, not immediately, not in a way that raised urgency. Just enough distance, just enough obscurity, just enough delay for the story to begin forming on its own. A story that did not include murder. A story that would explain itself without asking too many questions. Accidents are comforting like that. They don't demand accountability. They don't require a villain. They simply happen. And people accept them because acceptance is easier than doubt. Back near the original launch site, the boat sat exactly where it needed to be. Not destroyed. Not missing. Not suspicious in the way a violent scene might suggest. Just misplaced, like something that had drifted slightly out of routine. The engine position, the angle, the spacing of equipment, every detail, quietly nudged into place until the scene no longer whispered crime. It whispered misfortune, and that difference would decide everything. A duck hunter, cold water, heavy waders, a lake known for dangerous conditions and unpredictable currents. It wasn't hard to build the story. It practically wrote itself. Somewhere nearby, a truck and trailer were arranged with similar precision, not abandoned, not chaotic, but staged in a way that told a very specific story to anyone who arrived first. Mike had gone hunting. Something went wrong. He never came back. That was the version the world would inherit. And once a story like that enters official channels, it becomes surprisingly difficult to dismantle, because it is not just one explanation anymore. It becomes the explanation. The search began quickly. At first, it felt like urgency. Boats spread across the lake. Volunteers gathered. Radios crackled with coordination and concern. Flashlights cut through morning mist like threads of white fire. But beneath the surface of that effort, something subtle began to form. A narrative assumption. A quiet agreement that no one had formally spoken out loud. Accident. That word began circulating early, carefully, repeatedly, like a suggestion slowly becoming fact. Cold water drownings in duck hunting conditions were not unheard of. The lake had a reputation. The weather that morning had been cold enough, the environment unpredictable enough, the gear heavy enough. Every detail, when arranged the right way, pointed away from intention. And that was exactly the point. Denise Williams played her part with precision that later investigators would struggle to categorize. Not because she acted dramatically, but because she didn't. Grief, when performed under scrutiny, is often expected to break, to collapse, to spill over in ways that feel uncontrollable. But Denise remained composed in a way that some would later describe as strength. Others, with hindsight they didn't yet have, would describe it differently, controlled, measured, carefully contained. She answered questions. She expressed concern. She followed the rhythm of a wife waiting for news that she already feared but could not yet accept. And every response reinforced the same conclusion the search teams were already leaning toward. Accident, accident, accident. The word grew stronger each time it was repeated, until it stopped sounding like a theory and started sounding like certainty. The lake yielded nothing at first. Hours passed, then days, each passing moment reinforcing a psychological shift in the search effort itself. Because when a body does not surface quickly in water like that, the mind begins to adjust its expectations. Survival becomes less likely. Recovery becomes the goal. And even that begins to fade into acceptance. The human mind, when confronted with uncertainty, eventually chooses a version of reality that hurts least to hold. And in this case, the least painful version was simple. Mike Williams had drowned. An accident during a routine hunting trip. A tragedy. Nothing more. Nothing hidden. Nothing else to find. Authorities leaned into the environmental explanation with growing confidence. Alligator activity in the region became part of the narrative. The lake's reputation filled in the gaps where evidence did not yet exist. Nature became the suspect, not people, because nature does not require interrogation. Nature does not lie. Nature simply is. And that made it the perfect explanation. At some point during the investigation, Mike Williams was officially declared dead. Not found, not solved, just gone. A legal conclusion wrapped around a physical mystery that still hadn't been fully understood. And with that declaration, everything shifted again. Life insurance processes began. Paperwork moved forward. Systems that require certainty to function accepted the only version of events they had been given. A husband lost in an accident. A widow left behind. A case closed by default rather than discovery. Money followed grief the way it often does in cases that appear straightforward on the surface. Quietly, procedurally, without emotional interference. But beneath that surface-level resolution, something far more unsettling was already beginning to form. Because the story was not finished. It was being edited. Weeks later, subtle inconsistencies began to appear. Not in dramatic bursts. Not in sudden revelations. But in small, almost forgettable ways. Items that did not align with the original search timeline. Details that seemed slightly too convenient. Evidence that appeared after attention had already begun to fade. A pair of waders recovered in a location that had supposedly been thoroughly searched. A flashlight discovered in conditions that made its presence difficult to explain. Not impossible, but uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that investigators often try to rationalize away when a case has already been labeled, because reopening a conclusion is harder than accepting it, and acceptance had already been achieved, at least officially. The idea of foul play lingered at the edges of conversation, but it never fully entered the center. It remained a shadow thought, a question spoken quietly, then quickly dismissed. Who would benefit from a staged accident? How would someone even execute something like that without being seen? And most importantly, why? Questions like that rarely survive in environments already convinced they have answers. But in the Williams case, they didn't disappear completely. They simply moved underground, where they would continue to grow, away from official reports, away from public certainty, and towards something far more dangerous. Doubt. Because doubt does not require proof to exist. It only requires discomfort. And eventually, discomfort always finds a voice. In Mike Williams' case, that voice came from the one person who refused to accept the story everyone else had agreed upon, his mother. While officials closed files and the community slowly returned to routine, she remained anchored to something no document could erase. The absence of her son did not feel like an accident. It felt arranged. And somewhere deep in that feeling, a question began to take shape that would not let go. If almost everyone accepted the alligator story, why couldn't she? The answer to that question would not just reopen a case. It would begin unraveling an entire narrative carefully constructed to survive the very moment it was challenged. And what she would eventually uncover would not only question how Mike Williams died, but whether the lake was ever the real crime scene at all. The lake had already spoken in its own way. Silence, delay, a body that never returned when it should have. And for most people, that was enough to write the ending. Accident, misfortune, a tragic morning that belonged to cold water and bad timing. But grief doesn't always accept the story it's given. Sometimes it refuses it completely. And in the case of Mike Williams, the refusal began with his mother. Cheryl Williams did not cry the way people expected. Not at first. Not in the way that matched the official explanation being handed to her. There was no sense of closure in those early conversations. No quiet acceptance of this is what happened. Instead, there was something sharper beneath her silence. Resistance. Because even before evidence arrived, before reports were written, before investigators settled on language that made the case easier to carry, Cheryl already felt it. Something was wrong. Not uncertain. Not unclear. Wrong in a way that didn't need proof to exist. The accident theory didn't land in her mind as explanation. It landed as something incomplete. Something forced into place too quickly. While others saw a hunting accident in dangerous water, Cheryl saw something else forming in the gaps. Too neat, too convenient, too final, and her mind could not leave it there. The official explanation leaned heavily on environment. Cold water, heavy gear, alligator territory. A familiar combination that allowed uncertainty to be replaced with familiarity. But Cheryl did something most grieving families do not have the strength or clarity to do. She questioned the environment itself. Not emotionally, not vaguely, methodically. She began studying alligators in a way that was almost uncomfortable to outsiders. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. As if understanding the animal could unlock the truth everyone else had already stopped searching for. And what she learned began to fracture the official narrative almost immediately. Alligators, she discovered, are not active in cold water conditions like the morning Mike disappeared. Their bodies slow dramatically. Their behavior shifts. Their aggression drops. They become lethargic, nearly immobile in colder temperatures. That single fact didn't just challenge the story. It destabilized it, because the foundation of the accident theory depended on a predator that, under those exact conditions, should not have been functioning the way investigators implied. Cheryl didn't present this as speculation. She documented it, compared reports, cross-checked environmental data, and every layer she pulled back made the same thing clearer. The story was not tightening. It was loosening. And then came the evidence that should have ended the accident theory entirely, but didn't. The flashlight recovered from the scene. It still worked. That detail sounds small when spoken casually, almost meaningless. But Cheryl understood what most people missed. Water damage in that lake, under those conditions, should have rendered it useless. Not slightly damaged, not intermittently functional, but completely compromised, and yet had been found operational. Preserved in a way that didn't align with prolonged exposure or chaotic submersion. Then there were the waders. Heavy, designed to trap heat, designed to weigh down anyone who entered deep water. They were recovered in a condition that made Cheryl pause longer than anything else. Too clean. Not just physically clean, but strangely intact in a way that didn't match the violent, muddy, submerged struggle that had been described. There were no signs that matched the expected chaos of a drowning accident. No consistent evidence trail that aligned with panic, entanglement, or uncontrolled movement in freezing water. Just fragments. Pieces that should have told a simple story, but refused to fit together properly. And that refusal became the center of everything Cheryl would do next. Because once a mother sees contradiction where others see closure, she does not stop looking. She cannot. The official case had already been closed in most minds. The lake had taken Mike Williams. The system had processed it. The world had moved forward. But Cheryl Williams did something that slowly began to separate her from everyone else. She refused to move. At first, she searched alone, driving to locations tied to the case, rereading reports until the language stopped feeling like information and started feeling like a carefully constructed wall. Every answer she received felt rehearsed. Every explanation leaned toward simplicity. Every door she knocked on seemed to open just enough to reassure her, and then quietly close again. And the most disturbing part was not rejection. It was dismissal, not aggressive dismissal. Worse, polite dismissal, the kind that suggests the question has already been answered elsewhere, even if you were never shown where. Still, she continued, years passed, and with each passing year, her grief transformed into something that no longer resembled mourning. It became investigation. She placed newspaper ads seeking answers. Not once, repeatedly, persistently, as if repetition itself might force truth into visibility. She commissioned billboards demanding attention from a case that had already been labeled resolved, large, unignorable, sitting beside roads where strangers would pass and briefly wonder why a mother still needed to ask what had already been declared known. Letters followed, to agencies, to investigators, to anyone she believed might still be listening in the spaces where official answers had gone quiet. Her words carried a tone that did not soften over time. They sharpened, because time did not bring resolution. It brought contradiction. And contradiction is something the human mind cannot peacefully coexist with, especially a mother's mind. But the deeper Cheryl pushed, the more she began to lose something else. Her place in the lives of those still willing to accept the official version. Relationships began to fracture under the weight of her persistence. There were conversations that ended early, visits that became shorter, silences that grew heavier than words. And then came the point where pressure turned personal. A line was drawn that she could not step over without consequence. Access to her granddaughter, a connection she valued deeply, a connection that suddenly became conditional. The implication was clear even when not spoken directly. Stop pushing, or lose what remains. It is one of the most devastating tactics in any prolonged truth-seeking conflict, not because it is loud, but because it is precise. It targets the emotional core of persistence itself. And Cheryl had to make a decision that no mother should ever be forced to make. Truth or proximity to family. She chose truth, not because it was easy, but because she could not unsee what she had already begun to understand, that the story being told about her son did not behave like truth. It behaved like protection from something else, something still hidden, and somewhere, quietly, beneath the surface of official certainty, something began to shift. Not publicly, not openly, but within the structures responsible for maintaining the case file. FDLE reopened the investigation, quietly at first, without announcement, without acknowledgement that anything had been wrong in the first place. Just a slow return to questions that had once been considered answered. Evidence was reviewed again, reports re-examined. Details that had been previously accepted were now being viewed through a different lens, not yet accusing, not yet concluding, but no longer comfortable. And that change, no matter how subtle, is often the beginning of something irreversible. Because once a case that was declared an accident begins to be looked at again, the accident theory is no longer the only thing on the table. Cheryl Williams had not solved anything. Not yet. She had not proven murder. Not yet. But she had done something far more destabilizing to an investigation built on closure. She refused to let it end. And in doing so, she had kept the case alive long enough for doubt to grow where certainty once stood. Still, even as investigators quietly reopened old files, one problem remained unchanged. There was suspicion. There were inconsistencies. There were questions that refused to settle. But there was still no proof strong enough to overturn the official version of events. Not yet. And that gap between what is suspected and what can be proven would keep everything suspended in an uneasy balance for years. Because somewhere beneath all the reports, searches, and theories, someone had constructed a version of events that almost worked perfectly. Almost. And that word, almost, will become the most dangerous part of the entire case. The silence didn't end when the lake went quiet. It only moved. From the water into the people who knew exactly what had happened there. At first, life continued as if nothing had fractured. Paperwork was signed. Names were written into new futures. Homes were reassigned like the past could simply be filed away and forgotten. But secrets don't stay buried just because people agree to stop digging. They begin to rot from the inside, and rot always spreads. Brian Winchester was the first to feel it, not as guilt at first. Something more unstable. Something that doesn't allow rest. He tried to rebuild a version of life, that looked normal from the outside. Divorce came first. A clean separation on paper, but nothing about it felt clean underneath. It was the kind of ending that doesn't close a chapter. It erases the illusion that the story was ever stable to begin with. Then came Denise. The connection that should have felt like alignment instead carried something heavier. Because relationships born in the aftermath of a buried truth never begin as love. They begin as containment, as if proximity can hold the past in place and stop it from speaking. Brian and Denise married, and for a moment, it appeared as though the story had locked itself into a new shape, a final configuration. The people closest to the tragedy now sharing a life that had once orbiting around it. And then they moved into Mike Williams' former world. His spaces, his absence, his echoes still embedded in walls that had not forgotten him. To outsiders, it looked like continuity. To those who knew pieces of the history, it felt wrong in a way that was hard to articulate, because grief usually retreats after loss. But here, it had stayed in the structure of things, and now it had new occupants. At first, the marriage functioned like a performance of stability. Public appearances, controlled narratives, carefully measured interactions that suggested everything had settled into place. But underneath that surface, something began to shift, slowly, unevenly, like pressure building behind glass. Brian started changing in ways that didn't announce themselves all at once. He became watchful, not observant in a calm sense. Watchful in a way that suggests he was no longer certain which version of reality could be trusted. Small inconsistencies began to consume him. Conversations replayed in his mind longer than they should have. Words spoken casually by others started to feel loaded with meaning they might not have actually carried. And the more he tried to stabilize his surroundings, the more unstable everything became. Because control, once it starts to slip, doesn't fade quietly. It distorts perception. It turns routine into threat. It turns silence into accusation. Denise noticed the change before anyone else did, not because she was looking for it, but because she was already close enough to feel it forming. The marriage that had once felt like alignment now began to feel like pressure. Conversations grew shorter. Pauses grew longer. The space between words started to feel heavier than the words themselves. There were moments where Brian would simply stop mid-thought, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Not outside, inside. That kind of internal noise is often the first sign that a person is no longer living beside their past. But inside it, Denise began to distance herself. Carefully at first, not abruptly, because abrupt distance creates questions. And questions are dangerous when answers already exist that no one wants spoken aloud. But emotional distance has its own consequences. It doesn't reduce tension. It redirects it. And in Brian's mind, that redirection began to take a very specific shape. Suspicion, not grounded in evidence, but in fear. The fear that the same instability he felt internally was now mirrored externally in the person closest to him. And once that belief takes hold, it stops being a thought. It becomes interpretation. Every interaction started to feel layered. Every delay in response felt intentional. Every moment of emotional withdrawal felt like strategy. Brian was no longer just living in a marriage. He was analyzing it, trying to decode whether he was still in control of the narrative he had once helped construct. And control, once questioned, rarely returns quietly. Denise eventually filed for divorce, a procedural act on paper. But in Brian's mind, it landed somewhere far more volatile, not as separation, but as movement. As if something was shifting away from him that he could no longer predict or contain. And that is where fear changes shape. Because fear is manageable when it remains external. But when fear attaches itself to relationships, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes paranoia. Brian began to spiral, not in dramatic visible collapse, but in internal fragmentation. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already reorganized a person's entire perception of reality. He started seeing patterns where none had been confirmed. He began interpreting distance as planning, silence as coordination, emotional withdrawal as preparation, and underneath all of it, a single escalating thought that would not leave him alone. Exposure, not immediate, not guaranteed, but possible and possibility. In the mind of someone already unstable, is indistinguishable from inevitability. Because once the idea of being exposed enters the mind of someone who has built their life on concealment, everything becomes a threat vector. Every relationship becomes a potential leak. Every disagreement becomes a risk event. Every conversation becomes a test. And Brian Winchester was no longer just reacting to his environment. He was reacting to the possibility that the environment itself was closing in. Denise, whether intentionally or not, became the focal point of that pressure. The person closest to him, the person who knew the most, the person whose choices he could no longer predict. And unpredictability, in a mind shaped by secrecy, is intolerable. The marriage collapsed under that weight, but collapse doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it accelerates something worse. Brian now existed in a psychological space where connection had become threat and separation had become exposure. There was no stable position left to occupy, only shifting ground. And when a person reaches that state where every option feels dangerous, they stop acting rationally in the conventional sense. They begin acting to reduce internal pressure, not to solve problems, to relieve tension. Denise had moved out of control. The narrative was no longer shared, and the story they had once been parted together was no longer synchronized. That disconnect created something unstable enough to break containment. Because the most dangerous moment in any concealed crime is not immediately after it happens. It is years later, when the people involved are no longer aligned in silence, when memory starts to diverge, when loyalty fractures, when fear replaces coordination, and Brian was now alone with something that could no longer be contained by agreement. The psychological pressure did not build loudly. It accumulated quietly, in ways that would later be described as change in behavior, increased agitation, paranoia, but those labels flattened what was actually happening. A man who had once believed he understood control was beginning to realize he no longer controlled the system he had helped create, and that realization doesn't produce calm reflection. It produces urgency. Denise's distance continued. Brian's internal world continued collapsing inward. And somewhere in that shrinking space between them, something irreversible began forming, not yet spoken, not yet visible, but no longer avoidable. Because when two people who share a buried truth begin to separate, the silence between them becomes the most dangerous space in the entire story. It is no longer shared protection. It is competing survival. And in competing survival, someone always breaks first. Brian Winchester was approaching that point. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of someone who can no longer distinguish between fear and reality. And what came next would not feel like decision. It would feel like pressure finally finding its release point. After 16 years of silence, Brian Winchester finally snapped. The silence that had protected the story for years did not break gradually. It shattered, not in a courtroom, not in an investigation file, but inside a vehicle where the past finally turned on itself. For 17 years, the truth had been controlled by distance, timing, and silence carefully maintained between people who knew too much and said too little. But control only lasts as long as fear is evenly distributed. The moment that balance shifts, everything collapses. Denise stepped into the vehicle expecting routine, a normal exchange, a familiar presence, a life that, despite fractures, still followed predictable patterns. The door closed behind her with a soft finality that did not feel unusual at first, until it did, because the sound of a closing door can mean many things. Safety, departure, or a trap. Brian was not where she expected him to be, not beside her, not in front. He was behind her, still, waiting. The realization did not arrive as thought. It arrived as pressure. A presence too close, too immediate, too deliberate. Then the metal, cold, heavy, unmistakable, pressed against her ribs before her mind fully processed what her eyes were seeing. A gun, not drawn in anger, not revealed in chaos, but already positioned, already decided, already waiting for the moment where hesitation no longer mattered. In that instant, time stopped behaving normally. Every detail became sharp in a way that feels unreal in hindsight. The texture of the seat, the faint hum of the engine, the distance between breath and silence. And beneath all of it, something far more disturbing began to surface. Preparation. Because this was not a spontaneous moment. Inside the car, hidden in plain sight, were objects that did not belong to any normal scenario. Bleach, a tarp, items that do not appear in a vehicle by accident, items that belong to outcomes already decided. Denise saw them, and something inside her understood what her mind refused to say out loud. This was not confrontation. This was conclusion. Brian's voice came next, but it did not match the image of a man in control. It fractured, not into calm explanation, but into something unstable. Words that carried weight, but lacked structure. Sentences that looped back on themselves. Emotional pressure leaking through every syllable. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking through years of internal collapse, finally finding an exit point. 17 years of silence does not remain silent forever. It transforms into distortion, into paranoia, into a mind no longer able to separate memory from threat. Denise understood something critical in those first seconds. She was not dealing with a planned execution unfolding cleanly. She was inside a psychological implosion. And implosions are unpredictable, dangerous in ways that logic cannot map. Brian's grip tightened. The weapon remained fixed, but his control over himself was not. There were moments where his focus drifted, as if two versions of reality were competing inside his head at the same time, one demanding completion, the other resisting consequence. That tension made him more dangerous, not less, because instability removes predictability, and predictability is the only thing that allows survival strategies to form. Denise did not panic in the way most people imagine. Panic is often portrayed as chaos. But real survival is quieter than that, more focused, more calculated. She observed, listened, waited for gaps in his psychological rhythm, and she found them, small inconsistencies in tone, brief pauses where thought collapsed under emotional weight, moments where he stopped being an aggressor and became something closer to a man drowning in his own decision. In those fractures, she saw an opening, not physical yet, psychological. She began speaking to him differently, not challenging, not resisting, redirecting. Her voice lowered, her tone softened. She did not confront the weapon. She confronted the instability behind it, because sometimes survival does not come from overpowering force. It comes from interrupting intention. Brian hesitated, not fully, not safely, but enough for reality to shift by a fraction, enough for control to loosen. Outside the car, life continued as if nothing catastrophic was unfolding just inches away. People moved through their day unaware that a decades-old secret was now collapsing in real time inside a sealed space of metal and breath. That contrast is what makes moments like this unbearable in hindsight. The world does not pause for truth. Truth has to fight for visibility. Denise kept speaking, carefully, measuring every word against his emotional instability, not his logic. And slowly, something shifted. The pressure did not disappear, but it changed direction, from execution to conversation, from certainty to hesitation. And hesitation is the beginning of fracture. Bry was no longer fully anchored to one outcome. His mind was splitting between fear, anger, regret, and something far more dangerous, confusion. Because once a person starts questioning their own intent in real time, control begins to evaporate. The situation inside the vehicle became unstable in a way that could not hold for long. Not safe, not resolved, just suspended. A moment balancing on the edge of collapse. And then movement outside, a shift in visibility, public presence. A reminder that the world was still watching even if it did not yet understand what it was seeing. That interruption was enough. Enough for Denise to act. Enough for Brian's control to break fully. Enough for the situation to spill out of containment. The door opened. The sequence that followed did not feel like escape in the traditional sense. It felt like rupture. A break in reality where intention and outcome finally diverged. Denise got out. Brian did not immediately follow. And in that hesitation, The structure control that had held this entire scenario together for hours finally collapsed. Not gradually. Instantly. Police response came quickly after that moment. The arrest did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the first visible crack in something much larger that had already been breaking for years underneath the surface. Brian Winchester was taken into custody while still carrying the emotional residue of what had just unfolded. Not calm, not resolved, still inside the storm that had driven him to the edge. And for investigators, what they encountered next was not a suspect who had carefully maintained composure. It was something far more revealing. A man whose internal structure had already failed before questioning even began. The interrogation room did not need to force answers out of him. It only needed to hold silence long enough for pressure to do the work. Because once containment fails in a person like Brian Winchester, information does not need to be extracted. It begins to spill. But even then, nothing came immediately. Not clarity, not confession, only fragments, contradictions, emotional spirals that circled the same invisible center without landing anywhere stable. Detectives listened as a story long buried under layers of coordination. Fear and denial began to surface in pieces too unstable to form a complete narrative. And yet, even in that chaos, one thing became undeniable. This was not a random act. This was the end point of something that had been building for years. A collapse that had simply waited for the right pressure point. Denise had survived. Brian was in custody. But the most important part of the story had not yet arrived. Because the truth behind Mike Williams' disappearance was no longer just a theory held by a grieving mother. It was beginning to speak from inside an interrogation room. And what Brian Winchester would eventually say would not only change the case, it would destroy every version of the story that had existed before it. After 17 years, Brian Winchester finally started talking. The room did not change when Brian Winchester began to speak. No lights flickered. No dramatic interruption. No cinematic moment of collapse or revelation. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a man finally running out of places to hide inside his own mind. For 17 years, the truth had been buried beneath layers of silence, so carefully arranged that even the absence of answers began to look like certainty. But once pressure reaches a breaking point, silence stops protecting anything. It starts giving everything away. Brian agreed to cooperate, not in the calm, controlled way people expect from confessions in documentaries. It was not composed. It was not strategic. It was something closer to exhaustion finally overtaking resistance. The kind of surrender that doesn't feel like relief. It feels like fracture. Detectives positioned the recorder between them, and for a moment, before the first words even came, there was something almost unbearable in the air. Not anticipation, recognition. Because everyone in that room understood something unspoken. This was not the beginning of an explanation. This was the end of containment. Brian exhaled, and the story that had been locked inside him for nearly 2 decades finally began to move. At first, it came out uneven, fragments that circled around each other, without committing to structure, moments of hesitation where memory collided with fear. Pauses that suggested he was no longer fully inside the timeline he was describing. But slowly, the shape of it formed. Not softened, not justified. Formed. Mike Williams. The lake. The morning that had been labeled an accident for so long it had begun to sound harmless. And then the truth shifted underneath everything people thought they knew. Because Mike did not simply vanish beneath cold water. He fought. He survived. He reached for anything that could keep him alive in a moment designed to take that chance away. Brian described it not like a theory, but like memory he had spent years trying not to revisit. The moment Mike realized what was happening, the panic that followed, the chaos of water and struggle and realization colliding all at once. And then the most disturbing detail of all, Mike believed he would be saved, not by a stranger, not by chance, by him. That belief, according to Brian's own words, was present in those final seconds. And it changed everything about how the truth would later be understood. Because betrayal does not always begin with violence. Sometimes it begins with trust that is still intact when everything else is already breaking. Brian's voice tightened as he continued. The confession did not present him as calm. It presented him as someone still trapped inside the emotional echo of that morning. The shotgun, the lake, the moment when survival stopped being the outcome, and something irreversible replaced it. There was no dramatic pause when he described the final act, only a collapse in tone, as if language itself became heavier at that point. Mike had survived the initial attack. That detail alone reshaped the entire case. Everything investigators thought they understood about timing, cause, and sequence suddenly fractured into something far more disturbing. This was not a simple drowning narrative that had gone wrong. This was something that escalated, something that required a second decision, a final decision. And that second decision was where the confession stopped feeling like information and started feeling like weight no one in the room could fully carry. Detectives did not interrupt. They let the silence expand, because experienced investigators know something crucial about moments like this. When truth is finally spoken after years of distortion, it does not arrive cleanly. It arrives in pressure waves. And if you interrupt too soon, you risk breaking the only thread holding together. Brian continued. The lake, the panic, the realization that control was slipping not just from the situation, but from him, and the final moment where fear overtook everything else. Not fear of Mike, fear of exposure, fear of consequence, fear of what happens when a hidden decision no longer stays hidden. And in that fear, the story reached its final point of no return. The shot was fired, not as part of an accident, not as a continuation of chaos, but as a moment where survival for one person ended completely for another. The room did not react outwardly, but something inside it changed, because once that sentence exists in the world, everything before becomes reinterpreted. The lake was no longer a mystery. It was a stage. The accident theory no longer held weight. It became a cover that had lasted longer than anyone expected. And somewhere outside that room, a mother who had refused to stop asking questions was about to finally receive the answer she had been denied for years. The search for Mike Williams did not end with confession alone. It ended where the truth had been placed. Hidden, buried, removed from the place where it should have been found. Detectives followed Brian's account to the swamp, a landscape that already felt like absence before anyone stepped into it. Water that did not behave like water should. Ground that swallowed sound. Air that felt heavier than geography alone could explain. This was not a search site. It was a concealment site. Excavation began slowly, methodically, every movement careful, as if the ground itself might resist revealing what had been hidden inside it for so long. Time stretched in a way that felt unnatural. Every scoop of soil carried the same question. Is it here? And then the moment came when the answer stopped being theoretical. Something was recovered, not immediately identifiable, not fully visible at first, but unmistakable in its implication. Human remains. The swamp, which had protected the secret for years, finally released what it had been holding. And as investigators worked, another detail surfaced among the earth and decay. A wedding ring. Small, ordinary in appearance, but devastating in meaning, because objects like that do not belong to anonymity. They belong to identity. And identity, once recovered from concealment, does something irreversible to every narrative built before it. Mike Williams was no longer missing. He was no longer an assumption. He was no longer a question. He had been found. And with that discovery, the accident theory finally collapsed under its own weight. There was no longer ambiguity, only confirmation. And confirmation, in cases like this, does not bring peace first. It brings impact. For Cheryl Williams, the confirmation did not arrive as celebration. It arrived as collapse and relief intertwined in a way that cannot be separated. Years of refusal, years of questioning, years of being told to accept something that never felt complete. And now, the truth had physical form. Her son had been recovered, not from water, but from concealment, from the place where someone had tried to erase the meaning of what had happened. But even as investigators worked through the final stages of recovery, even as evidence confirmed what had long been suspected, something else remained unresolved in the background of the case. Denise Williams, Because even with a confession, even with remains, even with physical confirmation of murder, she continued to deny everything. Not loudly, not theatrically, but consistently. As if denial itself could still reshape reality if held firmly enough. And that contradiction would become its own final mystery. The truth had surfaced. The swamp had given back what it had taken. The confession had broken 17 years of silence. But closure, in cases like this, is never as simple as finding what was lost. Sometimes the hardest part is accepting what was always there, hidden in plain sight. The courtroom did not feel like an ending. It felt like pressure finally finding a shape it could no longer escape. After 17 years of silence, contradictions, and buried truths, the case of Mike Williams was no longer a rumor held together by doubt. It had a defendant, a record, a reckoning, and Denise Williams was walking into it, as if she still believed silence could protect her. The arrest had already shattered the illusion of distance. There was nothing private about it. No soft transition into custody. No gradual acceptance of consequence. One moment. She was living inside the structure of a life that had been carefully maintained for years. The next, that structure collapsed into public view. Handcuffs, onlookers, the quiet, irreversible moment where denial stops being useful, and the world finally aligns itself around accusation. But arrest is only the first rupture. The real collapse happens when stories begin to collide in open air, inside the courtroom. Prosecutors did not present a theory that asked for imagination. They presented a timeline that had been waiting, hidden beneath years of noise, a sequence of decisions, a chain of people, a design that only looked like coincidence until every piece was placed side by side. Mike Williams did not disappear into water by chance. They argued. He was removed from it. And everything that followed was not confusion. It was construction, carefully maintained, protected by silence, reinforced by delay. Brian Winchester took the stand, and the atmosphere in the room changed the moment he entered it, not because he was confident, but because he was no longer stable in the way people expect from witnesses. He did not look like someone delivering testimony. He looked like someone stepping back into a memory he had spent years trying to avoid. And when he spoke, there was no attempt to soften what he had done, only the slow, uneven breakdown of a story that had once been shared in secrecy and was now being dismantled in public. He described the morning, the lake, the decision points that turned survival into something final. And then he did something far more damaging to Denise's defense than any physical evidence could have done. He placed her in the narrative, not as a distant observer, but as part of the structure that made everything possible. That single shift changed the temperature of the courtroom, because murder trials often hinge on one central question: who acted alone and who participated in silence. The defense fought to isolate Brian, to position him as unstable, unreliable, a man rewriting his own past under pressure. They tried to turn him into the entire story, a single point of collapse that did not spread beyond himself. But the prosecution had something far more dangerous than argument. They had patterns, and patterns, once recognized, are difficult to erase. Recorded calls entered evidence, not dramatic confessions, not cinematic admissions of guilt. Something more unsettling. Familiar conversation fragments that no longer matched the innocence they were supposed to represent. Tone, timing, careful phrasing that began to sound different once context had already been established. Words that at the time may have felt ordinary, but in hindsight carried weight they were never meant to carry. The courtroom did not react loudly to them. There was no gasp, no visible collapse of composure, just a quiet recalibration among those listening closely enough to understand what was changing, because evidence like that does not explode. It accumulates, slowly, until denial becomes structurally impossible. Through all of it, Cheryl Williams sat in the courtroom, every day, not as a symbol, not as a figure of grief, but as someone who had spent years living inside a version of reality that no one else had been willing to fully accept. She did not flinch when details were repeated. She did not react when timelines were reconstructed. She did not turn away when the final shape of the case was made visible in full daylight, because she had already lived through the hardest part long before the trial began. the part where no one believes what you refuse to stop feeling. The trial was not revelation for her. It was confirmation. Painful, delayed, finally undeniable. As testimony continued, something else began to emerge in the courtroom atmosphere. Not certainty, not closure, something more fragile. Accountability forming under pressure. And then came the jury. Deliberation does not unfold in public. It happens behind closed doors where certainty and doubt fight without witnesses. But in cases like this, even silence outside those doors feels charged, because everyone already knows what is at stake. Not just a verdict, but the final shape of a story that has defined years of public attention, private grief, and unanswered questions. Hours passed, then more. Time in those moments becomes distorted. Every minute feels heavier than the last, as if a decision is physically resisting arrival. Inside the courtroom, families waited, attorneys waited, Cheryl waited, not with optimism, not with expectation, but with the exhausted stillness of someone who has already lived through the worst outcome and is now waiting to see if truth will finally be allowed to exist in its full form. When the jury returned, nothing about the room changed outwardly, but everything inside it shifted. The verdict was read. Guilty. The word did not echo. It landed. Heavy. Final. Irreversible in the way only legal language can be when it aligns with long-delayed truth. There was no eruption of celebration. Not immediately. Instead, there was a quiet break in emotional containment across multiple people at once. Prosecutors who had spent years assembling fragments finally allowed relief to surface. Defenses absorbed the collapse of their argument in silence. And Cheryl Williams did not move for a moment, because verdicts like this do not feel like victory. They feel like weight being returned after years of carrying it without permission to set it down. Sentencing followed. Procedural, structured, necessary. The formal transformation of conviction into consequence. Appeals were discussed. Legal processes that extend the life of a case beyond its emotional resolution. Because in justice systems, finality is rarely absolute. It is conditional. And even after conviction, the system leaves space for reinterpretation, challenge, and continued legal movement. But emotionally, something had already completed its arc. The story that began with a lake had ended in a courtroom. And yet, even as sentences were handed down and legal language attempted to close the file, something remained unresolved in the minds of those who had lived closest to the truth. Did Denise Williams ever feel remorse? Not the kind spoken in court filings or legal argument, but the kind that exists privately, unobserved, unrecorded, the kind that cannot be tested or confirmed. Did she ever truly understand what had been lost? Or had every action been justified internally by a version of reality only she could see? These questions lingered in the silence after the verdict, because the law can determine guilt, but it cannot fully explain inner life. And then there is the deeper question that no sentence can resolve. Was justice enough? For Cheryl, for Mike Williams, for the years of absence that stretched far beyond the moment of disappearance? Justice arrived, but it did not restore time. It did not erase memory. It did not return what had already been taken. It only confirmed what had always been suspected beneath years of uncertainty. And confirmation, while powerful, does not always feel like completion. As the courtroom emptied and the case moved into its final legal phase, one truth remained suspended in the space that no verdict can fully occupy. Even after convictions, even after confessions, even after recovery of remains, there are stories that refuse to fully close. Because some questions do not exist to be answered quickly. They exist to linger, to follow those who lived through them, to remind everyone that truth, when delayed for too long, never arrives cleanly. It arrives as something heavier, something permanent, and something that continues to echo long after the courtroom lights finally go out. Did Denise Williams ever feel remorse? Not the kind spoken in court filings or legal argument, but the kind that exists privately, unobserved, unrecorded, the kind that cannot be tested or confirmed. Did she ever truly understand what had been lost? Or had every action been justified internally by a version of reality only she could see? These questions lingered in the silence after the verdict, because the law can determine guilt, but it cannot fully explain inner life. And then there's the deeper question that no sentence can resolve. Was justice enough? For Cheryl, for Mike Williams, for the years of absence that stretched far beyond the moment of disappearance? Justice arrived, but it did not restore time. It did not erase memory. It did not return what had already been taken. It only confirmed what had always been suspected beneath years of uncertainty. And confirmation, while powerful, does not always feel like completion. As the courtroom emptied and the case moved into its final legal phase, one truth remained suspended in the space that no verdict can fully occupy. Even after convictions, even after confessions, even after recovery of remains, there are stories that refuse to fully close. Because some questions do not exist to be answered quickly. They exist to linger, to follow those who lived through them, to remind everyone that truth, when delayed for too long, never arrives cleanly. It arrives as something heavier, something permanent, and something that continues to echo long after the courtroom lights finally go out. The lake does not remember names. It does not keep stories. It only keeps moments, broken seconds, fractured breath, the sound of something struggling against a world that has already decided the outcome. And on that morning, long before anyone called it case, Lake Seminole held one final image it would never willingly give back. Mike Williams in the water, not sinking at first, not gone, alive, fighting. The surface was not calm for him. It was violent, unforgiving, a collapsing world that offered no direction, only resistance. Cold, so sharp it felt like it was cutting through thought itself. Every movement costing more than the last. And still, he survived it. Somehow, the initial fall, the shock, the panic that turns a body into instinct and nothing else. He broke through the surface again, gasping, disoriented, refusing to accept how quickly everything had changed. There was no time to understand it, only time to react. Heavy waders dragged at him like the lake had decided to claim ownership early. Each kick was slower than it should have been, each breath shorter, each second stretching into something that no longer felt like time at all. But Mike Williams did what survival demands. He fought, not with clarity, with instinct. He found something in the water, a tree stump, barely visible, barely reachable, the kind of object that shouldn't matter in any ordinary moment. But in that moment, it was everything. His fingers closed around it, hard, desperate, the kind of grip that carries more meaning than strength alone. It was not just physical contact. It was refusal to disappear, refusal to let the water decide the ending. His body shook violently as he held on, every muscle screaming against the temperature, against the weight, against the certainty of what was trying to happen to him. And then he looked up. That moment has lived in silence longer than anything else in this story, because that is where everything changed. Above him, the world was still there, still structured, still familiar in shape, if not in meaning. The boat, the air, the space between what should have been safety and what had become something else entirely. And Brian Winchester was there, close enough to see, close enough to help, close enough to end it. Mike did not process it immediately as betrayal. The mind does not jump there first. The mind searches for explanations that hurt less. Confusion, misunderstanding, a mistake, something reversible. His voice broke through the freezing air, not as anger, not yet as accusation, but as something far more devastating. Recognition mixed with disbelief. Because even now, even in the most impossible moment of his life, he still believed in the structure of trust that had defined his understanding of the world. Friends do not abandon you in water. Friends do not watch. Friends do not turn distance into silence when survival is still unfolding. But that belief was collapsing in real time. Slowly, irreversibly. Brian did not respond like someone rescuing a friend. He did not move like someone correcting a mistake. He remained above the surface of the moment, detached from the struggle happening only a short distance away. And in that separation, something inside Mike began to shift. Not suddenly, not fully formed, but enough of the truth to start entering where denial had been holding space. Because betrayal is not always a single revelation. Sometimes it is a sequence of micro-realizations that stack until mind can no longer avoid what it already knows. The cold water was not the worst part anymore. The weight dragging him down was not the worst part anymore. Even the fear of drowning was not the worst part anymore. The worst part was comprehension, that slow, unbearable recognition that the person above him was not part of his survival. He was part of the reason it was ending. Mike's grip tightened on the stump, not out of hope, out of refusal to accept what was forming above the waterline. But the body cannot negotiate with conditions designed to overpower it. Strength fades in cold water, not in dramatic collapse, but in increments so small they are almost unnoticeable until it is too late. His movements slowed, his breathing shortened. The world narrowed until everything that mattered existed only in a few feet of freezing space between survival and disappearance. And still, in that narrowing world, Mike looked up again, not begging, not fully understanding yet, just trying to reconcile two realities that refused to exist together, the man he trusted and the silence he was receiving in return. That contradiction is where the human mind breaks most quietly, not in loud emotional collapse, but in the exact moment truth becomes undeniable and still impossible to accept. Cheryl Williams would later try to imagine that moment, not from documents, not from reports, but from the unbearable space a mother enters when she is forced to reconstruct the final seconds of her child's life without ever being able to interrupt them. She would return to it again and again in her mind. The water, the cold, the impossibility of escape, and always the same detail pulling her thoughts deeper into something she could never resolve. Mike was not alone in that lake, not in a physical sense, but in the most devastating sense that exists in any human story. He believed he was safe with the very people who were ensuring he was not. That realization does not arrive as a dramatic moment of clarity. It arrives like collapse from the inside out, a slow understanding that trust itself had become the weapon, not the gun, not the water, not the environment. Trust, the belief that someone would not let you disappear. And that belief in its final form is what made the end possible. Mike Williams did not lose his life in the lake in a single instant. He lost it in the moment. He realized the lake was no longer the only thing trying to take it from him. Years later, when the truth finally came to the surface, Cheryl would stand at the edge of everything that had been uncovered and still struggle with the same unbearable thought. Her son had survived the freezing water. He had survived the trap. He had survived the impossible conditions that should have ended everything quickly. He reached for life in every way a human being can. And still it was not enough, because what he could not survive was not the lake itself. It was the realization of who had placed him there. And when that truth finally settled into the world, after years of silence, denial, and buried intention, it did not feel like justice in the way people expect. It felt like weight returning to where it had always belonged. A final, irreversible clarity that no appeal, no denial, no alternative explanation could ever fully erase again. Mike Williams survived the freezing water. He survived the trap. What he couldn't survive was a betrayal,